Studying communication can be fun, but also can be challenging. Sometimes you are required to explain this.
Sana ako pa rin. Ako na lang. Ako na lang ulit.
Mahal ko si Trisha.
Alam ko. Alam ko.
She loved me at my worst. You had me at my best. At pinaliwala mo na lahat yun.
Or sometimes, you have to analyze this.
May paliwanag mo bakit may 4 na baso ko sa likod?
Matagal na namin itinago ito sa'yo, anak. Pero sa palagay ko pa naman ang malaman mo.
Or make sense on what is happening here.
Winarat na ninyo kami eh. Winarat na ninyo ang dangal ng DOH. Winarat ninyo ang lahat ng mga kasama ko dito. Hindi kami makaharap sa mga tao dahil lahat, ang dami-daming sinasabi, ang dami-daming paratang. Wala pa rin akong tulog. Ilang gabi na po ito. Kasi this is really unfair, unjust. That this judgment has been handed down clearly without giving the DOH.
In studying communication, you always need to ask yourself, why is this happening? And after that, you will ask how to explain the why. Luckily for you, there are communication theories that can help us with these things. So, let's talk about communication theory. What is your impression of studying theory? Do you find it fun, challenging, fascinating? Whether you find studying theory interesting or not, you always need to study it because you will use it in your everyday life, especially in university. As curious beings, we always try to make sense of things around us. We always ask why. But why? Well, one explanation can be that things around us or things that happen to us affect us. And another explanation can be that we really care about it. That's why we try to seek to answer the why question and other questions that emerge in a particular event. That's when theory comes in. A theory is there to answer our questions and help us in making sense of the things we're curious about. But before we talk more about theory, specifically communication theory, let's try to define it first. According to Ernest Borman, who is a communication professor, a theory is an umbrella term for all careful, systematic, and self-conscious discussion and analysis of communication phenomena. While for Judy Bergen, who is also a communication professor, a theory is a set of systematic, informed hunches about the way things operate. Both definitions simply mean that a communication theory is used to explain a particular communication phenomenon. But it's not just an explanation. This explanation has a basis and follow a systematic and careful approach to arrive on that explanation. Communication scholars use all available information to come up with a particular theory. With these definitions, we also imply that a theory is not just one isolated idea or conviction, but it is a set of ideas put together to explain something. To sum up, a theory takes a careful and systematic approach, synthesizes all information and ideas on a given scope, and makes sense to our particular phenomena. We can also see theory in 3 different ways. Theory can be a net that is cast to catch the fish in the sea. We can only catch what is available and depending on the size of our net. Theory can also be a lens for us to see, and there are different kinds of lenses that we can use to see a particular object. Lastly, theory can be a map of the way a thing works. It can be a guide for us to navigate a certain communication phenomenon. I hope these things help you realize the importance of theory in studying communication. Now that we know what theory means and why we need to study communication theory, the next question that you might ask is, how do you turn ideas into theory? Or, how do you construct a theory? For this section, we will talk about epistemology, or how we arrive on what we call knowledge. Communication scholars have two general approaches in explaining a particular situation, or in arriving knowledge. One is using an objective approach, and the other one using an interpretive approach. The objective approach believes that truth is singular and the truth can be accessed through unbiased observation. Thus, scholars who use the objective approach construct communication theories that explain and predict a particular phenomenon or test if this truth covers everyone. The interpretive approach believes that there are multiple meanings or truths that can be gathered in a particular situation. In other words, truth is socially constructed through communication. Thus, scholars who use the interpretive approach construct communication theories that will assign meaning or value to a particular situation or event. Let's try to look at this ad.
May paliwanag mo bakit may apat na baso ko sa likod?
Matagal na namin itinago ito sa'yo, anak. Pero sa palagay ko pa naman ang malaman mo.
Objective scholars will construct or use theories that will explain why this ad generates more leads to buy the product and identify factors or strategies to support their explanation. On the other hand, interpretive scholars will construct or use theories that will analyze how this ad generates more leads by looking at the symbolic meaning of a particular action. These approaches are also commonly found in two academic fields, humanities and the social sciences. Social science theories and methods usually follow an objective approach, while the study of humanities is more interpretive. Remember that communication study is a product of these fields. That means we can use one of these approaches or maybe use both approaches to understand or explain a particular communication phenomena. Now, why are these approaches important? Because we cannot fully understand a theory if we are not familiar with its underlying assumptions about truth, human nature, the purpose of the theory, and its values. We might misuse a theory, or we may not get adequate results if we do not know which approach we will use. Now let's try to expand these approaches by mapping out the field of communication theory. Robert Craig, a communication professor, suggests that there are 7 traditions in the field of communication theory. These traditions have different views about communication, and these views affect the nature of a particular communication theory. Let's look at them one by one. First is the socio-psychological tradition. Communication is viewed here as interpersonal interaction and influence. Theorists looked for cause and effect relationships that will predict the results when people communicate. They also subscribe to empirical research to explain their theories. Second is the cybernetic tradition. Communication is viewed here as a system of information processing. The goal is to get the most information as efficient as possible. Theorists in this tradition seek to answer such questions as how does the system work? Or what could change the system? Third is the rhetorical tradition. Communication is viewed here as artful public address. Those who subscribe in this tradition do research or teach communication in a rhetorical or persuasive approach. Thus, effective communication depends on audience adaptation and tailoring of the message. Analysis of a communication phenomenon in this tradition usually focuses on those things. Fourth is the semiotic tradition. Communication is viewed here as the process of sharing meaning through signs. In this tradition, meanings are important depending on a particular context or situation. Because meanings are in people, gaps between subjective realities are bridged through a shared language or sign system. Fifth is the socio-cultural tradition. Communication is viewed here as the creation and enactment of social reality. It is based on the premise that as people talk, they produce and reproduce culture. This tradition shows that our view of reality is strongly shaped by our culture through our interactions and the use of language. Sixth is the critical tradition. Communication is viewed here as a reflective challenge of unjust discourse. Critical theories are constructed in this tradition. Theorists in this tradition looked at how social justice can be restored when ideological distortions are recognized through communication practices that enable critical reflection. And finally, we have the phenomenological tradition. Communication is viewed here as the experience of self and others as dialogue. The phenomenological tradition places great emphasis on people's perception and their interpretation of their own experience. In other words, the story of the subject is the most important thing to analyze. Notice here that some traditions follow an objective approach, while some follow an interpretive approach. Cybernetic and socio-psychological traditions are more objective, while phenomenological, critical, and sociocultural are more interpretive. Semiotic and rhetorical are more in between. We already mapped the field, and we are now ready to explore different communication theories. What's next? For this section, we will look at how we will evaluate a communication theory. If we're going to study a particular theory, we must also know how to evaluate it based on its scope, testability, parsimony, utility, and heurism. First is we need to identify the scope of the theory. Does it cover all interactions, or does it cover only a group of people? Is it a grand or general theory where the scope is broad, or is it a specific theory that covers only a narrow scope? How widely applicable is that theory? The ideal evaluation would be the conciseness of the theory. The less it covers, but still is applicable to all. Next is testability. Can this theory be tested? If the hypothesis of a theory can be tested or the results can be repeated and are accurate, then we will have a good evaluation of the theory based on its testability. On the qualitative side, if there is a community of agreement on the theory's claims, then the theory will have good evaluation based on the accuracy of results of testing the claim in an objective or interpretive approach. If a theory has parsimony, it has few concepts or assumptions. In other words, the theory is simple or less complex for us to understand and relate to different situations. Utility is the usefulness or practical value of the theory. We ask these questions. Is the theory practical? Can it help reform a society or community? Is it useful on our everyday lives? These questions help us determine if a theory has high Utility. Heurism is the amount of research stimulated by the theory. A heuristic theory means that it is used other theories or is supported by qualitative or quantitative research. Our goal is to discover what is true, and we use theories to guide us on our pursuit for truth. We may use or understand a communication phenomenon in two different ways, objective or interpretive. These approaches can also be mapped out using the 7 traditions in the field of communication theory: socio-psychological tradition, cybernetic tradition, rhetorical tradition, semiotic tradition, sociocultural tradition, critical tradition, and phenomenological tradition. This will help us understand a theory and guide us in using an appropriate theory for a particular communication phenomenon. Then, evaluating a theory based on its scope, testability, parsimony, utility, and heurism will also help us in choosing the best theory to understand what is happening around us. There are a lot of things that are confusing to us, but some of the communication theories that we will learn will help us understand the world better. So let's do our best to understand and appreciate the communication phenomena, one theory at a time.